Hey everybody, it's Mike from the Mike Wagner Show, powered by SoundWeb Studios, brought to you by our official sponsor of the Mike Wagner Show, international warring author Mia Molson's Missing, available on Amazon in paperback and ebook. Coming soon, Missing 2 by Mia Molson's Double Suspense, Double the Fun. Check it out on Amazon. Also, Mike Wagner Show is brought to you by The Sweet Psalmist by Serena Wagner, based on the life of King David, including 30 exquisite paintings and King David Psalms. The Sweet Psalmist is available on Amazon in paperback and ebook. Keyword Sweet Psalmist Serena Wagner. Also, check out the Mike Wagner Show at the MikeWagnerShow.com. 40 podcast platforms, heard in 100 countries. Check it out today. We're here with the amazing author, political scientist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and who studies the political psychology and public policy, and also co-authored a number of 9 books, authoring, co-authoring 9 books. He also has done some current research, including the impact of political engagement, the moral psychology of ideology, and also the partnership and mass incarceration. We'll talk more about that. His new book explains why the U.S. has become the biggest jail in the world and how it's accelerated basically by various partisan and social demographics in most of the areas, and the trending different styles, incarceration, and more. And the book is called The Jailer's Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. It's a must read on that one. Live, ladies and gentlemen, plus dudes in beautiful downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. The author, political scientist at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, studies political psychology and also public policy with the book The Jailer's Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. Ladies and gentlemen, the multi-talented Dr. Kevin B. Smith. Dr. Smith, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, it's great to have you on board, Dr. Kevin. Of course, this is something that does need to be reckoned with. You're an author, political scientist at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You study political psychology and public policy. You co-authored 9 different books. You also doing current research on the impact of political engagement, moral psychology and ideology, and partnership with mass incarceration. Your new book explains why the U.S. has become the biggest jailer in the world, and also having some factors involved in a number of states, different styles of incarceration, lowest incarceration rate, and some interesting statistics, some disturbing, and why this is happening. The book is called The Jailer's Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. And before getting all that, Dr. Smith, tell us how I first got started.
Sorry, could you repeat that question,
Yeah,
Mike? I didn't quite catch.
yeah. Tell us how you first got started.
Um, well, how I first got started with the book is that
Just first how you got started in your career, just getting into the being a political scientist and everything. How you got started, just go all the way back to how you got started.
okay. Well, I actually started as a reporter. I was
Okay.
a newspaper reporter for the first 5 years of my career, and I never had any ambitions to be an academic, and I'm not even sure I knew what a political scientist was. But I ended up covering politics, and I covered politics and crime for a number of newspapers, kind of like across the Midwest in Missouri, Illinois, and Wisconsin. And I originally went to graduate school to get a master's degree simply to become a better student of the system I was covering. And, I took a couple of grad courses and got really attracted to the idea of being an academic, primarily because rather than having a daily deadline to meet, I could take as long as I wanted to really take a deep dive into a question. And, if I chose, I could even spend years chasing it. And I found that enormously attractive. And so I sort of like got my PhD and became an academic. And then along the way, it turned out that I really like teaching. I'm kind of a ham, and I love being around college undergraduates. They kind of keep you young, and sometimes they ask you questions that make you do a double take and make you scratch your head and think, yeah, why does the world work
We've all
that way?
been there, done that. Believe me, I'll tell you. Even I get that at times. So
Yeah, so I kind of went to grad school and then have kind of lived happy ever after. And one of the things that I have taken with me into my academic career is sort of like a journalist mindset, in the sense that I have kind of like more than one research agenda focus. And I mean, you mentioned that a little bit in the introduction. I'm primarily known these days as a political psychologist, but I spent the first decade or so of my career essentially as a policy analyst. And, one of the policies that I spent a lot of time looking at was crime and incarceration. And that's kind of like where the interest for the latest book came from.
hmm And I think that's really something important to talk about with the current system. Of course, the changeover administration, how they handle incarcerations, and everything else that's coming up. And was it one precise moment that simply influenced you into what you do in the rest of your career?
I don't think it was one moment that sort of like influenced me, but rather an accumulation of them. And when it comes to mass incarceration, some of this goes back to my experiences as a journalist. I covered the crack epidemic in Kansas City in the mid 1980s. I covered some crime in East St. Louis in the late 1980s, which was at the time the murder capital of the United States. As an analyst, I spent a lot of time looking at the causes of crime across the states and essentially the politics of incarceration. And, what that background led me to, and, one of the primary reasons that sort of like got me interested in writing a book is the United States isn't simply the largest jailer on the planet. It has the largest ex-prisoner population on the planet. It's really hard to get, a full accounting of how many people, how many U.S. adults have a prison record, but a conservative estimate is somewhere between 1 in 30 and 1 in 35. If you break it down into certain demographics, in some states, it's 1 in 6. And I started to get really curious about what that's done to us. I mean, because this is a huge social experiment. We've never had Western liberal democracy where such a large proportion of its population has experience of incarceration. And I was just and became increasingly curious about what does that do to what does that do to a country economically, socially, politically? And the end result of that curiosity is the book.
hmm and what are some of the factors that are involving with ex prisoners and everything else? What is the cause of having all these ex prisoners that just like on the rise in the U.S. and what are some of the factors? And it keeps growing and growing, and it seems like what can be done about it to especially lower the number of ex prisoners.
Yeah, and the key thing that you mentioned there is you mentioned the plural. And I mean, obviously, the reason we have a large number of ex-prisoners is we've had a large number of prison people in prison, and this has been going on for about the last 40 years. And the era of mass incarceration really kicked off around 1980, and going through the 1980s and into the 1990s, and continuing even today. The United States started locking up people at rates that were historically unprecedented. And what drove that? I don't think it was one thing. I mean, and I spent a lot of time in the book sort of like taking a deep dive on this. I mean, part of it was rising crime rates, and not just rising crime rates, but a reaction to rising crime rates. Um, there was a racial element to that. There was also an element of increasing not just racial but ethnic diversity in the 1980s. That got to crime increasingly became a central topic of politics, and nobody ever ran for office and lost votes because they were being tough on crime. And, it's not just, a lot of people think of this as it was just law and order people, but increasingly all sorts of people sort of like turn to the criminal justice system to help solve problems. A good example is Mothers Against Drunk Drivers. We're calling for, more punitive responses to people who were, convicted of drunk driving. People in the LGBTQ community called for hate speech to be punished as a crime. So there were a lot of factors that came together that really sort of like pushed a lot of state legislators, and it really is the states that are driving mass incarceration to get more punitive on crime. And so we started locking up, millions and millions of people, and the net effect of that is we also started letting millions and millions of people, somewhere down the line out of prisons. And we ended up with this huge ex-prison population. And, there's not much that we can do to reduce the ex-prison population. I mean, it is what it is. We might be able to do some things about reducing mass incarceration, but the huge obstacle that you're always going to run into there is politics. Trying to persuade someone who has to run for office, you should back a proposal that does something like, reduce criminal penalties or give a judge greater discretion to take context into account when they're sentencing. Those sorts of things just aren't electoral winners. So there are some things that you could do to reduce incarceration levels, but they're not going to be easy. I don't think there are any easy solutions.
Mhm. And do you think decriminalizing certain elements, like say decriminalizing marijuana, decriminalizing drug use, or decriminalizing, say, with a fight against somebody, or decriminalizing someone free speech and all that, do you think that's going to help bring down the rate of prisoners, mass incarcerations, or anything like that? Like deregulate some of these laws, or drop these penalties?
Yeah, they might, but it would be a marginal effect, and here's why: the vast majority of people who are incarcerated in the United States are incarcerated in a state penitentiary because they've been convicted of a violation of state law, and the overwhelming majority of people who are in prison are in that situation.
Hmm.
And
And
the
of course,
vast majority,
oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
and the vast majority of people who are sitting in a state prison are there because they've been convicted of a violent crime, not because of, like, if you look at like drug possessions, it's 5% or less. The primary reason people get banged up is for committing violent crime. So if you want to reduce prison populations, an obvious way to attack it is to reduce violent crime. But that's a pretty complex and tough social issue to address.
And there's also some numbers we're going to throw out as well, too, in the book, with the book Jailers Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America, with Dr. Kevin B. Smith. But first, listen to the Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com, powered by SoundWeb Studios. Visit online at soundwebstudios.com for all your needs. Look at a professional website without breaking your budget. Sonic Web Studios is the answer. Sonic Web Studios offers fast, affordable custom web designs that blow the competition away. Call today, 1-800-303-3960. That's 1-800-303-3960, or email to support@sonicwebstudios.com. Mention the Mike Wagner Show, get 20% off your first project. Sonic Web Studios, take your image to the next level. Also, time to give official shout out to our official sponsor of the Mike Wagner Show, international warring author Mia Molson-Zia. If you love fast-paced mysteries, you'll love Missing by Mia Molson-Zia, available on Amazon, a paperback and ebook. Missing is fast-paced and intriguing with an unforgettable twist. It takes place in 4 countries, 2 strangers, 1 target, where truth is illusion and those who love it first go missing. It's available on Amazon, a paperback and ebook. Missing by Mia Molson-Zia has garnered great reviews and even loved and endorsed by Howard celebrities, including Joanna Cassidy, Forrest Riley, and many others. So grab your copy today for It Goes Missing by Mia Molson-Zia, available on Amazon. Coming soon, Missing 2 by Mia Molson-Zia. Double suspense, double the fun. Check it out on Amazon. Also, Mike Wagner shows brought to you by Sweet Psalmist by Serena Wagner, based on the life of King David, including 30 exquisite paintings and King David Psalms. Sweet Psalmist gives a new perspective of David through the Psalms he wrote as a time as a shepherd, and his complicated and turbulent relationship with King Saul is the love of hope, repentance, betrayal, love, and more. Check out the Sweet Psalmist by Serena Wagner on Amazon. Keyword Sweet Psalmist Serena Wagner. Also, check out the Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com. 40 podcast platforms. Heard of Han countries. Check out themikewagnershow.com. Make sure your ticket's with you on any mobile device. Subscribe and follow us on all social media and on Spotify, iHeart, YouTube, Anchor FM, Spreaker, and more for great gift ideas. Go to Amazon.com. Check out the Mike Wagner Show podcast. T-shirts, pop sockets, throw pillows, tote bags, hoodies. Makes great gifts 24/7. Go to Amazon.com. Check out the Mike Wagner Show podcast. And for more great gift ideas, go to Amazon.com/Mia Molson-Zia for great books like Missing, Once, and Wrinkles. Also, T-shirts, pop sockets, hoodies, phone cases, and more. Amazon.com/Mia Molson-Zia. Check it out today. Support the Mike Wagner Show on Anchor FM, PayPal, and the MikeWagnerShow.com. We're here with the author, political scientist at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, Kevin B. Smith, here on the Mike Wagner Show with the Jailers Reckoning: How Mass Incarceration is Damaging America. You're throwing some numbers out there, like with 1 in 3, 1 in 5, and having this prison population, all the numbers. There's also number 2, that 1 in 100 adults in Massachusetts serve a term, and 1 in 20 in Louisiana. So there's some of the terms throughout there. And also the lowest incarceration rate from 80 up to 2010 was in 5 states. And there's also other rates as well, too.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of variation from state to state. I mean, if you look at it nationally, you're more likely to have served a prison term than you are to have red hair. You're more likely to have served a prison term than to have green eyes. In some states, you're more likely to have served a prison term than to have shopped at Whole Foods or used a dating app. Um, but you know, the point that you were talking about the differences between states, I mean, the differences between states are pretty significant. I mean, you know, some states lock up their citizens at rates 5 times greater than other states. And you know, one of the big things that I try to delve into in the book is, you know, what explains that? Why is that? And there's, you know, again, it's a combination of things, but a big part of it is, you know, essentially the partisan and ideological nature of the state legislature and the voters. You know, democracy will respond to what the majority wants. And in a lot of states, the majority want criminals treated pretty punitively.
Hmm. And of course, the factor I'm thinking is 1 in 100 adults in Massachusetts served the term. And why is that you have 1 in 100 compared to 1 in 20 in Louisiana? It's like, is it the tougher laws, lenient laws, or more people willing to abide by laws? Or are they afraid? Or is this like, there's like a rebellion towards it?
Yeah, I mean, the big differences are differences in violent crime rates, differences in whether judges and district attorneys are elected. Appointed judges and district attorneys tend to be less punitive than those who have to face the ballot box. The partisan and ideological composition of the state legislature, conservatives and Republicans tend to be tougher on crime. And there's also a racial dimension to it. States that are more racially and ethnically diverse tend to be more punitive.
Hmm. And of course, another one too that the lowest incarceration rate from AA 2010 involves Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Minnesota. And plus, there's different styles of incarceration in those same states. You also got to throw in there, you got Maryland, Tennessee, and Kentucky.
Yeah, so you know that first set of states that you mentioned. I mean, obviously they have a geographic component to it, and that reflects sort of like an underlying political culture in that part of the country. But you can look at the flip side of that. I mean, if you want to look at high incarceration rates, look at southern states. You know, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Florida, and those states also tend to share a common political culture that is much more conservative in orientation than, say, you know, Massachusetts or Maine.
Hmm. And also, you have like different styles of incarceration, and plus, you also mentioned the Auburn system. And what is the Auburn system?
Well, yeah, there's what we think of as a prison, sort of like the stereotypical image that anyone has in their head of a prison is essentially a product of some, you know, for what was at the time pretty innovative research being done in primarily Pennsylvania and New York. And this was the Cherry Hill prison and the Auburn prison, the one that you just referred to. And essentially, what these prisons did for the first time ever is they created a form of incarceration where people were contained in individual cells, they wore uniforms, they were oversaw by, you know, uniformed guards. They were given meals. They were expected to work. They were expected to, you know, do things that would lead to their rehabilitation. And while none of that is surprising, right? Anyone who's ever watched a police procedural understands that as, you know, a pretty standard description of a prison in the 21st century. But that sort of thing hasn't been around forever. It's essentially a product of the 19th century. Um, and it was unusual enough at the time that it attracted a lot of interest from Europe because this wasn't the way that prisons typically functioned up till then. They were they were mostly kind of like people warehouses rather than institutions with a clear purpose of, punishment, deterrence, and rehabilitation.
And how's the system we have in America compares to Europe?
Well, it's much more punitive for one thing. Um, you know, we are much more likely to lock someone up. And if we do lock someone up, we're much more likely to lock them up for a longer time, in comparison to someone who commits the exact same offense in, say, Germany, France, or the UK. Another big difference between the United States and especially prison systems in Europe, for example, is that it is not at all unusual in the United States to be incarcerated a long, long way from your community.
Hmm.
And incarceration in Europe, it tends to be much more communally based. And some people argue this makes it easier to rehabilitate. It lowers recidivism. But in the United States, it's not at all unusual. For example, if you commit a crime in New York City, you may be incarcerated in upstate New York, where your spouse or loved one, your partner. I mean, it may create real barriers to having person to person contact with you, and that sort of like leads to kind of a loss of social cohesion. And if you have enough people in that circumstance, I mean, that can affect a community pretty badly.
Hmm. And what states do you think have the toughest incarceration at this point? We talked about some of the ones that are a bit more lenient. How about some of the other states that are very tough on it?
Yeah, I think some of the states that I just mentioned, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida is a poster child in many ways, not just because it has a tough prison system, but the implications of incarceration are pretty dire in the state of Florida. Technically, it doesn't have felony disenfranchisement anymore, but in practice, it still does. And one of the estimates that I make in the book, and I kept checking and double checking this, saying it has to be wrong. But this is what the data suggests, that in the state of Florida, at least in recent election cycles, 1 in 3 African American males has been legally unable to vote because of a felony record. And that is a big enough impact to have a potential election outcome ramifications.
You mentioned about the elections as well too, and the recent elections with Donald Trump coming back into power and taking office very soon. How is that affecting with the current situation with the elections and everything like that? And do you think that's going to affect futures? And also, how do you think is President Trump and administration is going to handle the incarceration situation?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I'm not going to lie to you. Your crystal ball is probably as good as mine. I mean, I don't think anybody ever really made money predicting what Donald Trump would do. Um, I think there is a defensible argument that in 2016, the ex-prisoner population played a significant role in getting Donald Trump elected in the first place. And the reason why I say that is, the election basically came down to Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And not just those 3 states, but only roughly 100,000 votes scattered across those 3 states. And if you add up the number of ex-prisoners in those 3 states, it far exceeds that number. And if they voted at a comparable turnout rate to the general population, and they voted the way that their demographics would suggest, Hillary Clinton would have won that election. And
Hmm.
I don't think there's any doubt that in 2000, um, the ex-prisoner population determined that election, because that came down to about 550 votes in Florida. And there were easily a net gain of something like, if there'd been no felony disenfranchisement, Al Gore would have probably had something like 90,000 more votes over George Bush. I'm not sure that you can make the argument that the ex-prisoner population played a big role in 2024, because Trump won the popular vote. And even though some of the swing states were pretty close, he won enough of them that I don't think it was on the razor's edge. But there's plenty of examples, and I go through several of them in the book, that the ex-prisoner population is probably determined some election outcomes, not because of who they vote for, but because they are either legally prevented from voting or because their experience with the criminal justice system has socialized them in a way that they simply don't civically participate.
Now, if you were run the whole system and everything like that, would you allow the incarcerated to vote?
Once they had served their term, yeah, I would be in favor of returning the right to vote. I would not support. I think there's a defensible argument that if you have, broken the law and you're convicted of a felony and you're incarcerated, I think it is a reasonable punishment that you do not have the right to vote while you were serving that term. But once you have done your time, you've paid your debt to society, I think the argument becomes a whole lot less defensible. And for some, if you've got a kid who's convicted at 18, serves 3 years, and then may spend the rest of his life legally prohibited from voting in the state that he resides, I don't see a justifiable argument for that.
You also talked earlier about being put to work and while you're in prison and everything else. Like you talk with the system and everything, and they also have it where it's like I was reading reports that they're being used for cheap labor. Like say we have up in North Dakota that everybody thinks it's they're in for make license plate. They also make furniture. They also make crafts and everything like that, and they're being used as a source of cheap labor. But it's okay, but then it's just like there may be some drawbacks to that.
Yeah, there are some big drawbacks to that. And just to push your point a little further, I mean, the range of sorts of jobs that they do, I mean, it's not just working in the prison cafeteria or the prison library. They build furniture. There are machine shops in prison. Down south somewhere, there's even a horse farm. With the big fires that are going out in LA, some of the people fighting those fires are inmates. They have inmates who are trained on fire crews. And there's an irony here because in some of the jobs that we've just mentioned, those are occupations where there's a demand for them in the labor market. But when people leave prison and they enter the labor market, even if they've got a valuable skill, something that is economically valuable that people are in the market to hire for, they oftentimes have a hard time finding a job because of that felony record. I mean, if you've got
Hmm.
a felony record on your resume, that's a bad thing to have when you're, seeking an employment. And if you've got enough people in that situation, mass incarceration is effectively acting as an underground labor market regulator. The labor market struggles to efficiently allocate labor because so many people have this barrier to employment opportunities. And one of the things that I look in the book, and spend quite a bit of time sort of like analyzing and crunching numbers, is that actually has macroeconomic effects. In some states, it can shave a point or two off of that state's gross domestic product. And if you're talking about a state like California, I mean, that's one of the largest economies in the world. You're talking about serious money that it's costing there.
Hmm. And I also thought about the whole ramification. They think, hiring a felon to get back to work and everything else. There's a lot of stigmas that are involved. And then if you were to run the system, it's like, how do we educate people to overcome these stigmas?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and unfortunately, I don't think I have an easy answer to it. One of the things that I do want to point out, given the topic that we're discussing right now, is there are programs out there and companies that actually kind of like go out of their way to try and find ex-prisoners employment after incarceration, and some of those are really successful. I mean, ex-prisoners can sometimes be really excellent employees. They tend to have a high degree of loyalty to their employer, for example. The problem is if you look at those programs and those employers who are, doing those sorts of really good jobs, if you look at what they're doing relative to the size of the problem, it's a drop in the bucket. So I think one thing that, could be done is that those stories could be amplified a little bit more. They could be given a little bit more visibility. And the second thing I think that could be done is that state governments could maybe sink a little bit more money into supporting some of those programs, because on a per head basis, that is way cheaper than locking someone up. In some states, it now costs $100,000 a year to keep somebody locked up.
Oh
That's
my goodness.
that is not cheap. Now it varies a lot from state to state. On the low end, it's been a while since I looked at those numbers, but say $30,000 a year. But you get out sort of like on the West Coast, California, where the government's job jokingly is referred to as educate, medicate, incarcerate. Those numbers are leaping towards six figures. And this is why some conservative state legislators are now sort of like starting to take seriously the notion that we've got to figure out a way to reduce incarceration numbers
Hmm.
simply on fiscal grants.
Hmm.
Um,
Something it made me think as well too. What about a person that's been wrongly incarcerated? That is a really big topic. It's almost like you're convicted of a crime that you never committed, DNA cleared you, or even something ridiculous like say you get 7 years in prison for stealing a tuna fish sandwich. Oh my God.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, what you're talking about is this guy Larry Davies, who walked into a Whole Foods in Austin, Texas, stole a tuna fish sandwich from the deli counter. And Texas is a three-strike state. That was his third strike, and he got 70 years for that. And in what world does that make sense? I mean, that is going to cost the taxpayers of the state of Texas an awful lot of money to keep him locked up. Well north of $1 million on the low end. And could we have not figured out a better way to spend a whole lot less money than that and get somebody like Larry Davies on a more positive trajectory where he's not going to be in the custody of the criminal justice system? I mean, I would argue that it's at least worth seriously investigating that possibility. And you also mentioned, people who are unjustly convicted or convicted of crimes that they didn't commit.
Hmm.
And
Or
and
or you
and
have someone that died fighting fires, protecting property, and there's others out there that who's she was not that inexperienced, but to go some of her training experience, can't find work. That's another stigma that has to be overcome.
yeah, I mean, the bottom line is once you've served a term in prison, you can unring that bell. Even if you were wrongly convicted and that is recognized and you are compensated, it's still lost time. That can still be a traumatic experience. That can still be a socialization experience in the sense of making you much less trusting of institutions, much less likely to civically participate. And those sorts of consequences are not just consequences that are borne by the people who actually serve time behind bars. All of us feel those consequences. I mean, if it is harming us economically, if it is eroding social trust and helping to hollow out communities, if it's changing the outcome of elections, it's not just people who serve prison terms who are served prison terms who are dealing with those consequences. It's all of us. And that's the ultimate point that I'm trying to make in the book is the mass incarceration phenomenon is not something that affects a tiny percentage of adult Americans who are actually behind bars. It affects all of us in very real ways.
Hmm. And what lessons can we learn from this? We'll find out with Dr. Kevin B. Smith in The Jailer's Reckoning, How Mass Incarceration has Damaged America. You listen to The Mike Wagner Show at themikewagnershow.com, powered by Sonic Web Studios, brought to you by official sponsor of The Mike Wagner Show, international warring author Mia Molson Missing. Also, Sweet Psalmist by Serena Wagner, based on the life of King David, available on Amazon. Keyword Sweet Psalmist Serena Wagner. We'll be back with the author Kevin B. Smith of The Jailer's Reckoning after this time out. We're back with author Dr. Kevin B. Smith of Jailers Reckoning, Mass Incarceration's Damaged America here on the Mike Wagner Show. We cover a lot of topics and cover a lot of statistics, impacts, and everything else. And most importantly, what lessons can we learn from all of this,
Well,
especially other countries?
I think the key lesson that I want people to learn from the book is one I've already mentioned. I really want to drive home the point that this is something that affects everybody. You are paying for it. If you're a taxpayer, you are paying for this. This is costing you money. You are paying for it in the sense, not just in the sense of what it costs to lock someone up. You know, those communities that are really affected by this, where social cohesion is fraying, those tend to be heavily policed communities, and that costs money. That costs money, and that creates sort of like a negative feedback loop that is really hard to get out of. And we all live with that, and we all live with the consequences of election outcomes. So the key thing that I want people to learn from the book is a realization that mass incarceration is not an abstract thing. It's something that is affecting your life, whether you know it or not.
And lastly, how can we help?
I think you can help by buying the book to be a little self-interested, because I think, you know, in order to sort of like get your mind around this issue and begin thinking about what to do about it, you first need to be well informed. And hopefully that's what my book can do, or at least help people can do, is understand the problem and its extent, and help them get their, not just their minds, but their arms around it.
And where can we find the book at? Which website?
Yeah, the best place to go to is my personal website, which is easy to remember, kevinbsmith.com, KEVINBSMITH.com. And it's also available in the usual places, you know, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, those sorts of places.
Okay, well, certainly check that out. We're with the amazing author, Dr. Kevin B. Smith of The Jail's Reckoning, How Mass Incarceration has Damaged America, here on the Mike Wagner Show. Just a few more things. Kevin, what else can we expect in 2025 and beyond?
Oh, well, I think in 2025 I'm going to be taking a little bit of a rest. This was a lot of work. The next big thing that I'm actually working on is a complete change of pace. I'm actually looking at how politics affects people's psychological, social, and even physical health.
Oh, that's an interesting one. So we'll
Yeah,
look
so
forward to having that.
I'm
Yeah, well,
switching from my public policy hat to my political psychology hat is the next thing that I'm doing.
I think that's very interesting and a nice change of pace. We're looking forward to that. And who do you consider biggest influence in your career?
The biggest influence in my career was my dissertation advisor, a guy by the name of Kenneth J. Meyer.
Okay. And what's the best advice you can give to anybody at this point?
Finish. That was the best advice he gave me. Everything from the only good dissertation is a finished dissertation. The only good question is one that you've finished answering.
That is a really good point. Just finish. I like that one. Not just do it, but finish. We're the amazing author, Dr. Kevin B. Smith of The Jail's Reckoning, Mass Incarceration has Damaged America, here on the Mike Wagner Show. Dr. Kevin, a very big thank you for your time. You've been absolutely fantastic. Learned a lot. Looking forward to having you again soon. Keep us up to date. Keep in touch. Glad to have you back. Once again, what's your website? How do people contact you? Where can people purchase or check out your book?
Yeah, just go to my website, kevinbsmith.com. That's got all my contact information and links to places to buy the book.
And we'll certainly check that out. Once again, Kevin, a very big thank you for your time. You've been absolutely fantastic. Looking forward to having you soon. Keep us up to date. Keep in touch. Live have it back. We wish you all the best. And Kevin, you definitely have a great future ahead of you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.